people and power. This is the Vichy in Rus, which is General Assembly, where city residents solve important issues together. And this is the Boyar Duma, the Council of Boyars, next to the Tsar. There, boyars were sitting, but didn't decide anything by themselves. Well, and this is the Senate of United Commonwealths of the Kingdom of Poland and the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealths of Rzeczpospolita, in which power resides in the country and the king was given the secondary role. And this is the governing Senate during the regime of Peter the Great. The senators entirely were dependable on the will of the Tsar. You are bound to have heard about the Kazakh Rada, the Council of Kazakhs. Here, military and political issues were solved, hetmans were elected and destituted. So, let's see the difference in political traditions between Ukraine and its neighbors and realize the way autocracy and autonomy, self-government, have been comparing centuries long. When the Kiev Rus was downright time-honored, the tribes lived there, and their leaders were chiefs, and the important issue were solved by elders at the tribe meetings. The elders were wise, and the chiefs were strong. Well, with a little luck, they can be wise as well. Then, gradually, the chiefs turned into princes or feudal lords that really liked fighting. And for the purpose, they needed the strong more than the wise ones. That's why a prince would keep Druzhina, prince's armed forces, close to self. They would both get into a fight with him and tried hard to keep the prince's head safe. Instead, he boarded them the best he could and provided them with the various privileges. Thus, the Druzhina fighters turned later into a middle-aged aristocracy, boyars, who were not only fighting with the prince on the battlefield, but also ruling the population. And the population was free then. That's why they liked together and show out for a while. That way, three components of the power mechanism in Rus were formed. They are monarchic, the one of the princes, aristocratic, the one of boyars, the Duma, and democratic, the one of common people, the Vichy. In the Kiev Rus, the country itself was viewed by princes as vachana, patrimony, which is a hereditary estate of the Rurikovichs. At the same time, the assembly of people, Vichy, was fully empowered. So it could call a prince to head, stole, the key position, entered a ryat, a contract, with him, or could even chase him away or reject him, not to allow to head stole. But let's turn to our Vichy. As a rule, it gathered in the courtyard of the prince, or the one of the church, or at the marketplace. They rang the bell of the Vichy, and all ran to council. A part of the most important matters of war and peace, sometimes it announced Zrada, and thought to change the prince's functionaries. It turned into a judicial body. You see, there were age-old traditions to influence powers since the Vichy maintained an equal position with the other government bodies on Ukrainian lands. At the time of the Grand Duchy of Lithuania and Poland, the Vichy meeting gradually disappeared. How was it run by the northeastern neighbors? In Zalicia, exhausted by the Mongol invasion princes, encouraged everything, and by the end of 14th century, all Vichy institutions were terminated, and later they wiped out their neighbors as well. The most tragic example was the story of Novgorod and Pskov merchant republics. In those places, the Vichy played the main role of the city government. Thus, in Novgorod, it ruled for almost 6 centuries, until the troops of the Moscow Prince Ivan III came there. They destroyed Novgorod Republic, and its autonomous power executed the most influential city residents and took the Vichy Bell away to Moscow. Pskov Republic lasted only for 3 centuries longer, and then was annexed by a Moscow prince. But at that time it was Basil III, and the Pskov Vichy Bell was withdrawn. This was the end of autonomous power over the lands that were subjugated by Moscow rulers. What happened to the Ukrainian cities? While Moscow rulers were annihilating the rest of the autonomy, the Magdeburg Right was on the country spreading over the Ukrainian lands. According to it, cities were partially liberated from the power of the feudal and could create the bodies of local self-administration. In every Ukrainian city that had acquired the status, it looked like this. The power belonged to the magistrate, municipal government, which was elected by city residents. The magistrate consisted of two panels, municipal council and lava. The number of members was determined by the size of the city and could vary from 6 to 24 people. Municipal members elected the mayor from their number, who was the head of the council meetings. Lava was a judicial city body that dealt mostly with criminal cases. Their members were Vyat and Lavniks. So were the law courts on our lands, both at Lithuanian and Polish time and the one of Hetmanshina. Such a city self-government existed almost up to the middle of 19th century. The Russian Tsar Mykola I issued the decree abolishing the Magdeburg Right in Kiev at the end of 1835. The Magdeburg Right, as a way of self-government on the Ukrainian lands, greatly enhanced the development of handicraft and commerce. In total, it was an opportunity to Europeize our cities, make the cities European. How was really the system of power formed up in Lithuanian-Polish state? We have already clarified the way it was in cities. At the state level, we deal with a peculiar story. In the Great Duchy of Lithuania, the higher power of the prince was limited by the so-called Pani Rada, the Council of Nobility. Within its competence, there was the election of the Great Duke of Lithuania, ratifications of laws, international affairs, defense of the princedom, great law court cases. Without doubt, the Pani Rada was rather an oligarchic body, but it greatly limited the power of the prince and favored the development of parliamentarism. After the Lublin Union was adopted in 1569, Lithuania and Poland were united into one state. The Sejm of Lithuania-Polish Duchy forced out this institutional body from the political arena, but the members of Pani Rada got the right to sit in the Senate of the state. Well, we have made it clear with Lithuania, haven't we? Let's expand the geography further to the west. The only for the entire state Sejm consisted of two chambers, the Senate of Rzeczpospolita and the House of Ambassadors, Poselska Izba. The Senate, a high chamber, encompassed 140 senators, which were formed members of the Sejm in the Polish kingdom, the representatives of Lithuania, Prussia, and deputies of noble smaller Sejms of Ukrainian lands. Among the city residents who had the right to sit in the Sejm were representatives only of the biggest places: Kharkiv, Gdansk, Warsaw, Lviv, Kamenets-Podolsky, Vilno, Mogilov, and the others. Within the competence of the Sejm, there were adoption of laws, introduction of taxes, calling of the army, nobilitation, the process of awarding the title or introducing into nobility. As a rule, monarchs only were entitled to do it in Europe, and in Rzeczpospolita it was conducted by the Sejm. What more, the Sejm formed the course of the external policy, adopted peace treaties, and kept total control of the king's activity and state servants. At that time, the procedure of monarch election was totally elaborated. Yes, you didn't seem to hear that. The king was elected. Elected! Don't be surprised. In your opinion, how do we, unlike Russia, have so stable election traditions? At that moment, the Henry Articles were in force in Poland. They were submitted to the newly elected king, Henry Valia, by the Sejm for adoption. By the way, take a look at the title of the last representative of the Vala dynasty on the French throne. That's the ties we have with Europe. So, Poles named the Henry Articles the Constitution. Any decrees of the Sejm were called Constitution, though. It was they that determined the fundamental basics of the political structure of Rzeczpospolita. What's more, Henry Articles conferred the right for Rokash, the rebel against the king in case he violated the privileges of nobility. Right to rebel. How do you like it? And the most important, the adoption of law occurred provided there was a unanimous decision. This way, the nobles and magnates expanded the previous law, nihil novae, for their own sake. It was the law that forbade kings to adopt new laws without a general accord of the nobility. And from the time of nihil novae, the system of political structure was named Rzecz Pospolita Republic. The right liberum veto enabled influential magnates to use it as an instrument of blocking the work of Seims in case of the threat of their interests. As a result, almost one-third of Seims ended up indolent or stone-walled for 2.5 centuries. It led to the crisis of the Sludge parliamentarism. As a central institution of the political system, the Seim disappeared at the same time as Rzecz Pospolita did. And our lands happened to be under the rule of the Russian Empire. Will you recollect about the Kazakh Dome? Sure, more powerful democratic traditions were formed on the land where self-government was conducted by the Kazakh Dome. It was peculiar customs, democracy where all military authorities were appointed by the Kazakh Council and reported to the community from way back in the old days. The democratism of the siege was almost in everything, in structure, forming of kurens, and division of lands, in election of authorities, where the Kazakh Dome itself was the source of power and the principle of equality was dominant at the Siecheva Rada, the council of the siege. It is clear that the Kazakhs' fair democracy, at least at the first stages of its existence, differed essentially from the Slacha democracy. In Zaporizhia, there were written laws. The procedures of elections, debates, and reports were simple, understandable, and some were rude. So a newly elected hetman was dusted so that he didn't stick his nose up in the air and could always remember from where he came to the highest position in the troops. At length, the Kazakh Dome built the entire election system of the hetman, general, military, and administrative authorities of higher and lower ranks, the so-called kuren atamans. At first, the system was spread all over the lands of the Zaporizhia army and later was used on the territory of the entire hetmanshina. It was natural that the influential Kazakhs were eager to join the self-government and political life of Rzecz Pospolita. Unfortunately, the Polish democracy had little to differ from the Russian one in this sense. It ended up with the Ukrainian issue. Ukrainians, represented by Kazakhs leaders and authorities, were not allowed to the state government affairs. Among the others, it caused the Ukrainian national revolution in the middle of 17th century. Though the Kazakhs didn't require much from the Seim and the king to keep Kazakhs' rights, elect a hetman and be sued according to the same laws as the Sklacha was. How about the parliamentarism in Moscovia? Pardon? Parliamentarism and Muscovy were always on opposed ends. Was there anything similar at least? Well, anything similar. For example, there was the Boyar Duma, the Council of Nobility, or Zemsky Sobor, the Land Council. The Boyar Duma was the all-time consulting body of the Tsar, some kind of the cabinet of ministers, where all the ministers have long beards and do whatever the Tsar tells them to do. The Land Council could be a pre-image of the Moscow parliament, but as always, it was not meant to be. But let's start with the beginning. The first consul in Moscow in 1549 was summoned by Ivan the Terrible, thus a monarch, who is considered the most formidable one of tyrants not only in Russian but also in the world history, opt and demonstrated the democratic initiative. No surprise though, the matter is that he was very young, only 19. He badly needed support of the people to fight with fat and adult boyars. 2 years before he decided that to be a Tsar of Moscow is more interesting than to be a mere prince, and he was crowned a Tsar without any delay. By the way, at that time he was almost a sane guy, but it was not too long. Do you remember that later he introduced oprichnina, death squads? It is interesting enough that the decree of Ivan the Terrible on oprichnina was adopted both by the Boyar Duma and the Land Council. After that, the most formidable period of terror in Muscovy began, first of all against boyars themselves. Ivan the Terrible and his death squads slaughtered several thousands of boyars and their relatives, a year after they tried to get over themselves. Most landowners even attempted to protest. In 1566, about 300 noble representatives submitted a humble petition to abolish oprichnina, and democracy ended up in Moscow as always. 50 of the petitioners were punished with great penalty. Some of them had their tongues cut, and 3 of them were beheaded. Let's look at their self-government and land councils. In fact, there were not even the limited institutions of democracy in Moscow state, which could be similar to the ones in Europe. No one from the researchers knows the way elections were conducted in land councils, since there was no comprehensible procedure. You see, the advantage of the European election system lies in its clearly determined procedures. The weakness of Russia and all countries of the Orthodox civilization stems from the disrespect to the written law and contact-like relations, inclinations to do everything wisely, as conscience dictates, according to the customs. Although from 1549 to the end of 17th century, the Land Council was summoned 50 times. There was neither the order of convocation, nor competence, nor even the name. The term Land Council was later invented by researchers. It turned into the instrument of enchanting the autocratic power of Tsar instead of being an instrument of limiting it. It failed to be a carrier of the people's will. It transformed in the mouthpiece of people's grievances and suggestions, and it's not the same. Moreover, it didn't refer to political rights and influence on the state government. By the way, at the Council of 1653, where the issue of taking Ukraine under the High Tsar's hand was discussed, many Moscow deputies were against it. Many of them yelled that Cherkasy, the way they called Ukraine then, won't tolerate the hand of the great sovereign and will set an ill example of insubordination of the other subjects. And as always, the opinion of the Kremlin overpowered the thoughts of people, and up till now it backfires us. Then the difference of mentalities was brightly manifested. Do you remember the Pereyaslav Rada? The council in Pereyaslav, when Kazakhs, having sworn fealty to the Tsar, required a loyalty oath in keeping Kazakhs' right from the Tsar's ambassadors instead. Well, they got accustomed to the way while interacting with kings of Rech Pospolita, and Muscovites flatly refused. Because the parties of Pereyaslav Treaty spoke different political languages. Kazakhs didn't understand why the sovereign, to be more accurate, his ambassadors couldn't give such an oath, and in their turn, the legates of the Tsar were just surprised with posing the questions of the sole-ruled oath. At that moment, Tsar representatives displayed the flame of revenge inherited from the Golden Horde, where the main principle was everlasting and unconditional submission to the sovereign. The last to play with Russian parliamentarism was the most progressive Tsar, Peter I. As soon as he began to rule, the Land Council stopped being summoned and the Senate appeared. But in order to understand how much the body was absolutely dependent on the absolute will of the monarch, it is enough to read the decree on its introduction. 18th century in Russia is the time of final establishment of the political system, which was principally different from the democratic one, that is to say autocracy or absolutism. The emperor assumed all powers of legislative and executive government. The process was begun by Peter I and was completed by Catherine II. At first, it was destruction of the Kazakh Sich, the lands of which were handed to numerous favors, abolishment of the military system and the army of Kazakhs, enslavement of peasants, liquidation of law court and judicial proceedings. What can we say? Yet in the late 18th century, the rest of democratic traditions of Ukraine was successfully buried under the imperial oppression. But as history proves, in consciousness of Ukrainian people, they have left forever. Thus, it is important to understand that the main difference between Ukraine and Russia lies not only in language, ethnic components, or religion, but also in different political traditions. As Yaroslav Hrytsak writes, through the intermediacy of Rzeczpospolita, Ukrainian lands had constant ties with West Christian countries of Europe, where other traditions and types of relations between the state and the society were formed, which essentially differed from the ones that finally appeared in Moscow lands later. Thus, democratic traditions, self-government, civic society have been formed by our people for centuries and are part of our history and present days. And power is represented by people and is not something heaven-like and untouchable.